Joe, what are you doing over there? You see my hands? What are you doing over there? And then see me mouth top. See my mouth top. And someone else.
St Michael's Estate, which was built in the late 1960s, is one of a number of flat complexes in the city that's currently being overhauled. During the 1980s, what was considered a housing success turned into one of the most notorious areas of the South City. Heroin and unemployment turned St Michael's Estate into a no-go area. Dublin corporations vowing that the same mistakes won't be made again. As many as 1,000 people are to be accommodated in a mix of private and public houses and apartments. Traveller and senior citizen accommodation will also be provided. Demolition of the landmark flats is due to begin in 2002, with the project expected to take 6 years to complete. Aisling Bastable, FM 104 News.
FM 104 News.
The bank guarantee is to be wound up at the end of next month. It was introduced in September of 2008 after a collapse in the share prices of Irish banks. Demolition of the last tower block in Dublin St Michael's Estate started today as part of a regeneration project. 75 new housing units ready by June after a 15-year wait.
As the last of the tower blocks came down, St Michael's Estate was built back in 1969 at the same time as Ballymun. It went on to develop the same drug and crime problems as other estates, but now it's being cleared. It's a partnership between developers and Dublin City Council. Residents admit it will be a battle to get the next phase of the regeneration up and running.
It was 1970 when I came to Michael's Estate. When Keogh Square was demolished, we moved over to Drimnagh. Like, I was engaged when I went to Drimnagh, and we weren't there that long when I got married, and then I moved back into St Michael's 160 with my mother-in-law for a while.
I lived in block 2, I lived in block 5, I've lived in block 7.
I lived just down there beside the Clock Arch, 204 Keogh Square. I remember them coming along then and starting to rip it out inside, and then coming along with a big steel ball and locking it down.
184 Keogh Square. I still remember the number.
And then we lived up in 172, and then we lived in 163, and we lived in the Mary Quarters then, number 30. We were all old.
1 and 2, well, they were the last two to be finished, block 1 and 2.
I was born and reared in Keogh Square, 67 Keogh Square, and then I moved over to 193.
And there was the Crowleys,
Kennedys, the Cairns,
and there was the Hounds,
the Scullies,
the Hegartys,
the Hillocks,
Sheila Hennings,
Jay Haggerty,
Sadie Flo,
Joe Lark,
Fraser Watt,
Cora,
Alice just lived up there,
the
all
Finns,
his
and
life.
there was the Muir,
Down O'Reilly's Lane,
Mrs. Peacock,
Stamford,
Christianis,
there was
the
Caddens,
Brackens,
Finnegans,
Little Carol,
there was Smiths,
Mr. Short.
The Adamses,
Joe Guns,
Tony Healy, that, but he died very young, violently.
90 McGrath, and Annie Scully.
We were all there for years together, and they were great neighbours. People used to say to me, "Oh, I didn't know you lived in the flats." Like, I mean, I wonder what sort of person you were supposed to be living in a flat.
This until recently was the site of St Michael's Estate, and before that it was Keogh Square, and before that it was the Richmond Barracks. St Michael's was built in 1969 and replaced Keogh Square. And Keogh Square was of course originally the Richmond Barracks, which was here for 105 years before that.
After the Napoleonic Wars, the 1798 Rebellion, the French Revolution, and this being the second city of the empire, the British started to reconstruct their barracks and think about this. So they started building a necklace of barracks around Dublin City. They already had Pigeon House Fort built, which was built in the 1600s, but they strengthened that. Then they came up and they built Beggar's Bush Barracks, then they moved up and built Portobello Barracks, then they built Wellington Barracks, which became Griffith Barracks, then they built Richmond Barracks, then they moved on around to Island Bridge Barracks. They strengthened Collins's Barracks, which was built in 1701, and then they moved on up to McKee Barracks, which they built in the 1890s. And then that was a necklace of barracks around the city. So the city was secured. That was the second city of their empire.
Well, this is Golden Bridge House. It takes its name from the little bridge that for centuries spanned the River Cammack. It was once the home of William Smith, and he owned most of the land in this area. In 1809, his son sold the land here to the British authorities for the purpose of creating a military barracks. He retained the house and the land in the immediate vicinity, and this was later acquired by the Sisters of Mercy in 1855. When the military were considering putting a barracks here, they took into consideration the fact that we had the Grand Canal here, which was a main route of transportation around the country. Then, of course, at the front of the barracks, you also had the main coach road to the Curragh and into the Dublin city. It was all a very strategic move to build it here, and of course it was on elevated ground, 90 foot above sea level. If you look at the period when it was built, it was at a time when it was greatly feared that Napoleon Bonaparte might invade these shores with a view to going from here to invading England. So that's why you had the Martello Towers around the coast. Ironically, within a year of the completion of Richmond Barracks, 1814, following year, 1815, was the Waterloo, and the problem with Napoleon was gone.
Says, I think that it's crazy giving these people a new area. Stephen in Duleek, it's a waste, it'll be wrecked again. Marianne in Clondalkin, I think St Michael's Estate should be revamped, it badly needs it. Colin in Drumree, the base of
But it was like gold dust to get a flash in here. It was. Because no matter where you went, where you live, Michael's Estate, it's beautiful there. You know, everybody said that. And then after, in the last couple of years, it started going down. Well, the corporation kind of interviewed people before they came in, but in the end, they didn't care who came in. It was like Keogh Square all over again.
This barracks was built to accommodate about 76 officers and about 1,600 men. They joined for adventure, they joined for the King's shilling, they joined for clothing, accommodation, food. A lot of them joined no work to support their families, money being sent home to their families while they were away.
Lots of local people join the army for all kinds of different reasons. Men who enlist are commonly looking for a secure enough job. It may not be very well paid, the pay was poor and the conditions were harsh, but you were guaranteed a couple of meals a day. And within the context of the 19th century, that's a pretty good deal. I know it sounds difficult for us to understand, but regular feeding was not common for the poorest in Irish society. So recruiting sergeants would say, well, you get a shilling a day. And when a recruit agreed to join, money was pressed into his hand, and that was the King's shilling. So it refers to both the pay and the bounty that they were given when they joined. In reality, they didn't get a shilling a day because all of their clothes had to be paid for. So everything a soldier wore was paid for out of his wage. The only thing he got from the army without paying for it was the roof over his head and the food. Everything else he had to pay for in some way or another. Most people who join are poor young men.
So that's what the British Army was about at the time. And at that time, 40% of the British Army was Irish. It wasn't a lot to do with loyalty to the King or the Queen.
My great-grandfather, James Gandy's from Knockcrockery in County Roscommon, and when he was 17, I think around 1894, he did what I suppose many of them did, living in rural areas on a very, very barren homestead. He walked from Knockcrockery to Athlone, to what we know now as Costume Barracks, and he signed up for the Connacht Rangers. And he trained there, and he did a stint in England. Still only 17 now, and then 3 years later he married a local woman, Lizzie Dowling from Athlone. That was 3 days before Christmas, 1897, and then within a month and a half he was in India, in Ahmednagar, about 4 hours inland from Mumbai as we now know it.
Within Ireland itself, there are 76 barracks in the late 19th century that are built and occupied by the British Army.
Well, I brought you here to Vincent Street because here we have a section of the remaining wall of Richmond Barracks, and you can see the scale of the wall, the height of the wall, and this wall stretched the full length of the barracks along Emmett Road here. It would have been at least this height, perhaps even taller than this.
This gate here is the gate into the old barracks in Fermoy, the very first one built in this town. But gates like this are found in every barrack across the country. Richmond Barracks would have had very similar entrance gates. They're a very standard style, and it's built by the Board of Ordnance, which is why they're the same in every barrack in the country.
Well, exactly where I'm standing now, there was an entrance gate into Richmond Barracks. And when you went through this gate, you saw two arches. One was leading into the officers' side of the building, of the square, and the other into the private soldiers.
So these would have been built with local labour, and you can imagine how many men it would have taken to build so many walls and so deep and so thick. The materials are sourced locally, which is why so many of them are limestone, which is the most common material in Ireland.
So on this side, you had a line of buildings all the way along here, right up to the graveyard wall, and these were 3-storey quarters for the private soldiers, and in the middle was a clock tower, and when you went through that clock tower you were in the parade ground for the private soldiers.
And this barracks was particularly used for training men to go off to fight in parts of the Empire, Egypt, the Sudan, South Africa, mainly in the Boer War. So they would have been recruited into this barracks, trained here, heavily trained here, in musketry training, trench warfare, stuff like that, getting prepared to travel out overseas. So that's what mainly this barracks was used for. Irishmen in the British Army stationed in Ireland would have been trained, and they would have been sent off out to places like the Sudan, South Africa.
Well, the Crimean War is a notorious event for the Victorian Army because the numbers of men who died from exposure, poor clothing and poor food was enormous, and it became a national scandal. And as a result of the Crimean War, Florence Nightingale becomes a very significant figure in changing attitudes to nursing and to sanitation and to the living conditions within a barracks. As a result of that, the government is forced to provide some basic facilities for men within barracks. How basic barracks were is hard to convey, but men living in a dormitory room, say 12 men, had a barrel in the centre of the room in which they relieved themselves at night. That same barrel was filled with water in the morning, and they washed themselves from it. So it was appalling sanitation.
Living in close conditions, they would have got TB was rampant at the time, and so close to each other, coughing, picking up germs. Then of course troops coming back from missions, not like today when we go overseas today, you get malaria tablets, you get injections against all types of things, vaccinations. Then they were sent off to these foreign lands, they were coming back, also brought back a certain amount of VD, malaria from mosquito bites and all that. And actually the British Army, Irish Army headquarters in Park 8 was initially a special hospital for diseases that the British Army had brought back.
And if we look down here, you'll see that there's a building, and this is actually a mortuary chapel. So when the barracks was given up, this mortuary chapel was left out on its own. And when the new scheme was built here, it ended up in a man's garden.
They always put the morgue outside the barracks for morale reasons. That's the wall, boundary wall of the barracks. And they always put the morgue outside the barracks. Now I can show you the walls are 2 foot thick. It's 20 feet long, 10 feet wide.
And you have an upstairs?
I put it upstairs in it. I put that upstairs in it because it was so high. But you
Yeah.
see, that's the original dome roof.
It was a dome roof, yeah.
That's it.
Right. Yeah, well, you can imagine now in the history of Richmond Barracks, there was a lot of suicides, you know, soldiers who just couldn't take the harsh military regime, and a lot of them, they cut their throat or hang themselves or shoot themselves. And they would have all ended up here where you're standing now. And then there was a lot of fevers. Typhus was a common fever. As I mentioned earlier, it was when you drank the water, if it was contaminated, you could come down with typhus fever. The lads coming back from the Zulu War from Rook's Drift, after standing up to 4,000 Zulus, one of them actually died of typhus here, and he would have been laid out in this morgue.
Well, as you know, typhoid was rife in this barracks particularly. There was a big epidemic here of typhoid, you know. And that was another problem with heavy drinking within the army. Men drank beer more than they drank water, because the beer was healthy, it was cleaner, it was more tasty than the water. This was why a lot of soldiers are connected with the drink problem as well.
6 per 100 were allowed to marry. Some broke the rule and married, but their wives were not welcome in the barracks. And for that reason, there was another accommodation set up outside the barracks, known as the She Barracks, down in the area of what was known as the Puck.
When a woman married a soldier without an officer's permission, she was married off the strength, and this meant that she wasn't entitled to anything from the army. Women who were married on the strength received half portions of food every day for themselves and their children. They also could receive medical care and accommodation within the barracks.
When the barracks first was built, there was no provision at all for married soldiers. And then they would have had to share accommodation with others. Eventually then married quarters were built up to the rear of the barracks. But then again, it was limited. Now some soldiers disobeyed the rule and they arrived back with women. And these were not welcome in the barracks. But that's why they were put into this outside accommodation known as the She Barracks.
For women who married off the strength, they were given nothing. This was okay if your soldier husband was willing to support you and was willing to support you outside the barracks. And men did share their rations with women. However, when troops were moved, either abroad or to another town, many of these women were left behind. And then their economic position becomes very serious. They were often very poor. Women and children who are married to soldiers appear in workhouse records seeking indoor relief in the workhouse. And as there are so few economic opportunities for women, unfortunately a lot of them had to turn to prostitution.
Well, I would classify as like somebody I wouldn't fancy living next door to.
Yeah, you're looking for a definition of scumbag. But would you not say that these people, there could be just one scumbag in there and they're just naming the entirety of the family as scumbag?
Yes, I think 60 million and a lot more should be pumped into it because reason being, I live on the north side of the city, we have these problems, Sheriff Street, Ballyboss, Killarn Street, that's all impoverished. And like I think
There was actually 3,000 Sinn Féin people here arrested after the rising. So you can imagine how much accommodation they had here.
Well, it was Republicans plus anyone who happened to be hanging around the street. They just, you know, they arrested about 3,000 people, including women, and they were marched here.
The women are marched with the men from Patrick Street up to Richmond Barracks, and they're being protected by the soldiers because you do of course have the separation women and, you know, the people of the area who don't necessarily understand what's going on. Why have they done this when something much bigger is happening in the world?
Then they marched up to Thomas Street, known as the Small Dardanelles. All the husbands away fighting on the Western Front, and it was here that they got the abuse. Apples thrown at them, spit at them, rocks being thrown at them. They didn't agree with the rising. They were getting that king's shilling and they were afraid this was going to be stopped.
And there is a lot of anger against the volunteers, and you can certainly understand that because they're seeing that their husbands are dying fighting a real enemy, you know, and these people should not be fighting that enemy as in the British government. They should be actually fighting with those men on the front. Now it all changes very quickly, you know, within a week that attitude completely changes.
And when the women arrived here, the Common and Mon women, there were 77 women brought here, and they were put into the married quarters. They were kept away. and then they were brought to Kilmainham and the North Dublin Union, which later became St Brendan's Hospital.
They arrested about 3,000 people. Initially they were kept in the open square behind a wire enclosure where they were scrutinised by detectives and officers. Anyone found to have incriminating documentation on their person, they were brought over to the gymnasium where they were further scrutinised by detectives behind a screen.
The 1st of May, the Count had been arrested the day before and kept in Ship Street Barracks for the night and then brought to Richmond Barracks. So now he was in Richmond Barracks with his 3 sons, but not knowing they were there and not seeing them. He was in a room with 27 other men, which he said was intended for 11 soldiers. And they had, there was 1 bucket for the whole lot of them, and they were there like that for days.
When they were brought here to Richmond Barracks, Dublin Metropolitan Police, Royal Irish Constabulary and G Division, and they would have been behind panels and walls and they would have picked them out because the British Army didn't know who these people were. They didn't know Michael Collins, they didn't know William T. Cosgrave, who was from this area.
They lived in James Street. Now you see, he was in the 4th Battalion of the Volunteers. They had quite a crowd in the 4th Battalion who covered both the South Dublin Union and Marylebone Lane. Now the South Dublin Union is now where James's hospital is, and he got them to use the nurse's home because it was a solid building. He held them at Mount Brown. They weren't able to get up Mount Brown. They had them completely cornered off. And then tragedy, Gavin Burke, my father's stepbrother, was 19 and he was shot by a British. He was a volunteer, only 19. Now my father and Philip, his brother, were both arrested. They were brought to, first of all, I think, to Richmond Barracks. Oh, he was court-martialed and sentenced to death. My father for the South Dublin Union and his brother Philip for Marylebone Lane.
This is the gymnasium where anybody who was suspected of having any key role in the rising was brought and where they remained overnight. People were brought out from the gymnasium here to be court-martialed. They were brought over to a block that was precisely where this nursing home is today. We have the court-martial, the witness statements, where we have people who remember sitting on the grass here waiting on some of the court-martials to be finished for their turn to go in, and there's an account of Pearse coming out of the court-martial.
The Count, he was brought to a guard room. He looked out the window and he looked down and there was his son Joe standing in the yard, and Joe was waiting for the results of his court-martial. And Joe looked up and saw him, and they stayed just looking at each other for a very long time. And my grandmother said her father was in tears when he told her that. So Joe then was told that he was sentenced to death and marched off to Kilmainham. The Count said that he was lying awake during the night and he heard the sound of shots, and he was certain that it was his son's death.
A total of 190 were court-martialed, 90 were sentenced to death, and of those 90, 13 at Richmond Barracks had the sentence confirmed. And then you add to that James Connolly and Thomas Kent in Cork, and of course Roger Casement in England.
Now the 2 of them were, and others were reprieved. You see, Kent was executed, and Tom Clark and others, you know, who were regarded as the principal people in the thing. Now, then they stopped it because there was a terrible outcry against the way it was done.
There was a lot of heated exchanges in the House of Commons, and Asquith eventually came over to see what was going on, and he visited the prisoners at Richmond Barracks, and after that things became a lot better. As well as that, he put a stop to the executions.
96 were sentenced to death. The British did commute their sentences. the likes of Harry Boland and people like that, Eamon de Valera. So they were sent to prisons all over England, to Wanford Prison, Winston Green Prison in Birmingham, Walton Prison in Liverpool, and then they were all shipped off to a prison camp in North Wales, a place called Frangach. About 1,200 Irish were shipped up into Frangach in North Wales.
Come on, Daddy, go on your own! Go on, Martina! He's on! She needs it's gone! And there's it's gone! Him with the carbon
Let me put it this way, Mario. The banks will pay it, no question about it, and rightly so. And much more importantly, if there is any bank that defaults, that default will be borne by the banking sector.
Which started out when I'd say about 4 or 5 years ago, and now they really are enforcing it now at this stage. And I think it's money, well, it's not at all on people.
The cost to Ireland to go borrowing now has gone up because our risk rating has gone up.
Yeah.
So we're going to pay for that.
Yeah, but sorry, that should be covered in the guarantee. That should be reflected in the price which the banks pay. We shouldn't be asking the taxpayer to pay more for ordinary government borrowing just because they're bailing us out. We need to actually come up with that.
The figure of 2 billion is mentioned in the paper today.
This barracks was very important from the time of the 1916 because of the executions. During the War of Independence there was extra troops in here. Their job was to guard the train stations around Euston. Their job was to guard the Royal Hospital Kilmainham. Their job was to do guard duty in Kilmainham Jail. Their job was to do patrols around the city. So the barracks was always active.
In 1922, of course, we had the handover, and we have the iconic photograph of the Irish Army marching in and the British Army marching out. And it was then renamed, Keogh Barracks after Commandant Tom Keogh of the Free State Army. With the treaty being ratified, and there was no really a need for a military barracks here, and there was a debate in the Seanad because there was a great need for housing at the time. One man wanted all of the military barracks turned over for housing needs. In the end, it was only one set of barracks, Keogh Barracks, that were approved for housing, and it was W.T. Cosgrave who approved it for housing, apart from 3 buildings that didn't lend itself too well to conversion into housing, and those 3 buildings were the 2 recreation rooms and the gymnasium. And these were then sold to the Christian Brothers, who were badly in need of a bigger school. And so the barracks were converted into flats for corporation tenants. And then it acquired the name of Keogh Square.
I was born in Chancery Street, 1922. Near the forecourts there, that's where I was born. We were put out down there. The soldiers was there at the time. They were all around the forecourts. That's the time we were all put out. The first time I came up here, where we had nothing in Keogh Square, not a thing. And my mother lived in the 3-story. There were only 3-story buildings. Every one of them was. My dad died when I was only 2. I was only a little one.
Well, the man was from Crabbadden Street, and the old man came from the Keogh. They got married in Francis Street, and then come up to Keogh Square, living with Auntie Nellie for a while, and back into Meath Street, and then back to Keogh Square again. And my Auntie Nellie lived in that block there. That's right. Right. And my granddad lived in that block there. At the beach.
All over the place.
Yeah.
But there was 7 of you, wasn't there?
Yeah. There was. I was born in 151 Keogh Square, 17th of June 1942. And Granny Mac, the next door neighbour, I think she brought us all into the square. Don't mind me. And I always helped out with the birds.
I'd one at home. There was a load of midwives there. Granny MacDonald was one of them, Granny Kerwin was another woman. And then Johnson, his mother was a midwife. She was coming out.
Well, in 1954, I was born. My mother and father lived in Ballyferm at the time, Ballyferm Parade. There was 4 boys, and it's just a father and then a mother. But then the mother died of breast cancer. She died, I was only 3 years of age. I was just 4. I was just 7 or 8 days from being 4, you know. But then, like I say, a couple of months later, through my father not being able to pay the rent, the corporation put us out of the house. So they thrown 4 kids out of the house, and my father, they put us in the Sean McDermott Street. So we went from a house to a tenement building. Whatever happened in Sean McDermott Street, in regards to rent as well, so we moved from there into Keogh Square. Moved to the Keogh Square around the 1960s. When we moved in there for 204 Keogh Square, the people were just phenomenal. They kind of welcomed you, they helped you. Everyone was good to each other. That's the recognition I have of Keogh Square, you know. They were decent people, yet a lot of them were struggling.
You wouldn't be short of a shilling, everyone shared a shilling with you, you know, that time. Everyone shared that and that you could get with you.
First memories of the square was we would have lived down here and then squatted in up here because we only had a room that somebody lent us till my dad squatted in this house over here. 26 was our number, right facing the ash bin and then right facing the wicket across the Golden Bridge.
I came from J Block, which I lived in 116, the court martial room. And there was six families in each hall.
Right, in the J Block.
In the J Block, yeah.
Right. Of course, you didn't know anything about the history of it.
Never
That's
knew about the history of that room.
In the school, when you were in school, they never
mentioned it.
I didn't know this was an army barracks. I did not know. My DNA comes from here because nobody in my family was in the army. And something hit up me in here. And I just didn't know. I was shocked when I heard it was called Richmond Barracks.
I lived here in 130 Keogh Square in the cottages, and there were the huts, also known as the officers' quarters.
Well, this was where the main square would have been. Around roughly where we are here would have been the clock arch. So you'd have had to go through the clock arch, you would have had the main square, which is all this grass here. I would have lived along here. When you went into the clock arch, you had cottages over there, and you had the hall where the wards lived, the Harcourts. You had a few shops there, the chipper, the rent office, which led up then to the married quarters, and up here to where you see the graveyard there, the start of the graveyard, and the burial wall, as it was called then. It wasn't called the graveyard, it was called the burial, and that ran all around there. Came around the top of it then, you went over to Josie Finity's.
They were big rooms, because your big rooms, you could kick football in them. And I remember my mother's big room, which I had my own wedding there. It was so big.
The barrack rooms were very, very big, very spacious, which seemed attractive when they got the rooms first, but then they realised that these rooms were very, very difficult to keep warm. And the only source of heating they had was the open fire.
And my granddad was the caretaker of the school before Mrs. Keogh. When you look in there, it wasn't that big.
No.
To us as kids, it was enormous. It wasn't enormous at all. And Hitler Adams lived in that hall. And you had to make the airplanes. Right there.
Facing
right there.
Where the air, facing the air.
You don't know how he got the name, no?
Do you know how he got his name? Hitler. His name was Francis.
He used to get up on the counter. He'd come from school and he used to come up on the counter, short trousers he had. And he'd salute, he'd say, "Hi Hitler, hi Hitler." That's why they christened him Hitler. He was only a little boy.
Is that you there, is it?
We take them before.
That's
me, that's you.
That's Caroline and then our baby sister.
That's how you see them. That's her.
That poor chap there.
What's your names again?
Maxine. I'm Maxine and she's Caroline.
And the rest of them are the Herberts.
The Herberts, I remember the Herberts.
That's the mother Herbert there.
Was that you there? And that's your other sister here?
Yeah.
And the other sister is here?
The younger sister, And the rest of them are all here.
That was in the 60s.
The mother's very small.
Well, this would have been the rear of Richmond Barracks and the graveyard wall, and it created a lane. The official name on the top of the wall here is Bulfin Street, but everybody knew here as the Berry Ground or Berrier Lane, and it extended around here, up here towards the canal. And back in the time of Keogh Square, a lot of tinkers had their caravans parked along here.
The reason why they chose this Berrier Lane is because the people accepted them, you know, and that was good. Because down the country now, if they were camped for a while, they'd be stoned out of it, especially around Galway. That's where I'm from. It was the people that accepted them. But the families that I know that lived here now, there was Stokes, Wards, McDonough's, the Dohertys, and the Keenans. The ones that came, they'd come from places close to Dublin. Later on, they came from Galway and the rest of the west.
When we were kids, like there was all where the graveyard is. There was a lane, like, and the gypsies used to live in the very corner of the lane. And we used to come home and get into an old motor car, broken old car. We used to dress up as houses, shops and houses, and we get loads of black porter bottles and we break them up there with the black chocolate sweets. And the last ones was the jelly sweets, the last bottles, jellies. So she thinks we had to blame it.
Yeah, well, our part of the square was said from Scotty Burden's Hall over to Affinity Shop. It was a small square there. That's where we used to play our football with a bouncer and our skipping and spin the bottle and relivio and things like that, That was our playground.
Our devil there had a shop down at Hell. He sold pennywinkles and he was doing very well. A halfpenny for a cotton ball, a twopence for a gun. And our devil there had his own one on the run.
You'd play a thing called In the Mouth, where you'd open the little shower and you'd be thrown a penny trying to get it into it or the nearest to it, or try penny up to the nearest wall, which you would have played against the school wall there. Swimming in the summer, you lived for the canal. Everybody, you spent every single day in the canal.
Fellas used to swim in the canal. Now I didn't swim in the canal because I couldn't swim now, But the lads used to throw their nicks out into the road. So the cars went over them, thinking to dry them,
They used to call us Teds. The dry pipes, the long jackets, and just spick and span, real jilty. And they may fire up in Clondalkin, they wear it up in the Obelisk. Father Divine, they'd be there, and you'd try to get close to a gatel, and he said, I wouldn't allow that. Can't get a sheet of paper in between us.
I met him as a postman. He came to the Barracks that time, that's how I met him. And I met him for Fulton Cinema. I went to Rialta Cinema to see Gone with the Wind. And I lined up 3 hours and a half. Just started when we got in, Gone with the Wind. And I lined up for 3 hours and a half. I was drowned and wet, drenched. And I had a red belly on me. I'm talking about Gone with the Wind. The time the belly came down my face. And he had red trousers. He had flannel white trousers. And I had suntan on my legs. And the suntan went to his trousers. And when he went home to Kilwood Road to his father, the father wanted to know what happened to his trousers. He was all red flannel. The flannel trousers, when he was young, Oh, I got married in Michael's church. It was only came to be a Catholic church that time. And I made my first communion in the convent up here. Golden Bridge Convent, I made my first communion.
There was a lot of families living around Keogh Square, related to one another. They used to say there was headless horsemen running up and down the big square.
And there was stories around this area too about the headless horsemen, and there's other ghost stories around this area.
And they said it was haunted, it was, you could see the nuns going around and the soldiers going around, the headless. But I've never seen it in any way, but they did say that it was haunted. So if that was haunted here, it's haunted because it's on the same ground.
We struggle now, we struggle with regards to trying to make ends meet. And like I say, we called it a stew house. And they look after people in the square who were having a rough and couldn't make ends meet.
Penny dinners, well, they got them here, and at a later stage they got them from the main house, Golden Bridge House, where we were earlier today.
Well, they used to call them penny dinners. You just go over there and they'd be sitting down, and you'd get a penny dinner or get a breakfast off them even before you went to school. And the nuns, like I said, the nuns are great. It's the same with the school. We used to get sandwiches in the school, That played a big part, in helping people in the square.
So the nuns, they kept a lot of the population alive back then,
Women were always cleaning. Women were always cleaning out the hallways and the stairways and everything else. And during Corpus Christi was a big time there now. flags flying everywhere, you know, and buntings. They built a lady's statue down near Emma Road, just at the wall there, and they built that, say, 63, 64.
It was fairly cold in the winter. Now, we didn't have electricity then for quite a long time. We had old gas mantles.
The Department of the Environment has said there are almost 90,000 families waiting for social housing. The government says it will begin to tackle the issue next year by providing 5,000
And then I think it was around the middle of 50s that we finally got the electricity, you know, that finally came. And that was a novelty for quite some time.
But when I was a little young one, they all went to England. Everybody went to England. Because there was no work here. There was nothing for no one. They all had to go to England. Every one of them.
But when we were a kid now, a lot of the men folk were over in England. That'd be during the war. And sent over the few bob over to the wives. But of course, I wouldn't know it. I was only a kid, you know. Now, only in the summertime you see them coming home and bringing home a bit of grub and stuff like that.
Then you used to have some of them here. They used to be dependent on the telegram to come in from England, from the war. Like, they used to send money over.
It was very hard to get a job living in Keogh Square. Well, like at the time, I wouldn't have really even known that at the time, you know, because we got on great with a lot of people around the areas, even the shops and all that. They were lovely people. But like going outside the district to look for a job, if you mentioned you lived in Keogh Square, I'd say, you know, Keogh Square, now that's a rough, and it was a rough place now, you know.
Would it affect your job prospects now?
I did, yeah.
You have a job, then they, what address are you? Keogh Square. Sorry.
I lived in 116 St Michael's Avenue. That's what we used to call it, right?
Yeah,
if you were going for a job.
If you said Square.
116, yeah, if you said Keogh Square,
forget about it, you shut down.
You weren't getting it, you weren't getting the job.
You weren't getting anything.
Well, I lived in the hall room, my mother with 3 children and 3 kids. 3 boys, which are there, them 3 boys I had in the barracks. But I used to only give my mother half a crown for that room, because that's all she charged me, 2 and 6. I liked the barracks. My mother, we had luck in that little room, always had luck in it. Always. And anyone that ever took that room off my mother, they all got a little house out of it. Very lucky little place it was.
The Beatles start coming into it then, you know, the Beatles, the tight trousers and the teddy boys and the wrinkled picker shoes and the haircuts, the style of the haircuts. A lot of the lads who are starting to get older, and as they start getting bits of work, they start buying the gear then, you know, the good clothes and all that. We're looking at them, you know.
Yeah, you see, at that time to see the Teds, and they were so-called ruffians, you know, but they were fighting against each other. And of course, we were only kids, teenagers.
Well, a lot of people, you know, they worked in different jobs. You know, some of them worked on Spar Road, but buses, on the buses, fixing the buses. You know, they repaired the buses or built the buses. And when we were kids going down, we were rough and ready, holes in our shoes and everything else. But things started improving, you know.
They were making Drimnagh at that time, building all the houses up in Drimnagh, and they were building them out in Talla, and they were building them out in Ballyfarmid. Everyone got their own little home, you know, fixed up. See, when they went out, the people bettered themselves, you know, they went out.
Well, the clock tower, we called it the clock tower, but I don't think it was a clock. There wasn't a clock on it at all. But during, I'd say it was 1960, 63, 64, they started knocking down parts. They knocked down the clock tower, and all the building going right along that side. People eventually moved out, and we used them walls as a handball alley.
All the old people moved out, they all died, half of them. They're all dead now, I'm sure, yeah. It went down terrible. They didn't clean the places, and we used to clean down them stairs and all. We did.
Well, people are moving out. People are moving out of the square. Crumlin, Drimnagh, there's a family there, McCarthy's, and one of them was a friend of me, my brother's Joey McCarthy. I remember we helped to move them. I think it was Crumlin or Drimnagh we moved there, lovely cul-de-sac. I remember even going there, bringing the furniture into the house and the fresh smell of paint.
From the Barracks to Belmadigan, then from Belmadigan to Bluebell. And I was 11 and a half years in Bluebell.
69, I think we left the square, 68, 69.
Yeah, it would have been around that time we would have.
Where'd you wind up then?
East Wall. East Wall, yeah, all of it, East Wall, yeah. Because that was a docker, you know.
Ah, well, there we go.
At 13, I'm 11 alive now. I buried the 2. I have 7 great-grandchildren, 7. They're all my grandchildren. And they all come to me now and again. How are you, Nanny? How are you, Nanny? Everyone now comes to me.
See, I love the flat. It's hard to explain to it. Though, as I said, I came from I was born and reared in the house, but the flats were gorgeous. You had running hot water. You had all the comforts, you know, and it was all in the one bill. You were paying it there. Where in the house, you have 4 or 5 different bills.
The pattern of tax cuts and the over-dependence on revenue from the property sector and high consumer spending.
That time my wages, what you call when I started, was only £2.26. But like, that was a lot of money. When I left my job, my rate was only £6. £6 something it was.
The housing situation is particularly acute in Dublin, where 19,000 families are on the waiting list.
When I found out we wouldn't have to light a fire, it was great. And then the extra room and a bathroom.
This until recently was the site of St Michael's Estate, a complex of 10 blocks of flats. St Michael's was built in 1969 and replaced Keogh Square. You had 10 blocks and 4 of them were 8-storey and 6 of them were 4-storey blocks. It accommodated, I think it was 346 units of housing.
The estate would have come about when I'd have been about 14, 15. We were in the cottages. I think we were the very last to leave Keogh Square. I think it might have been May 1970 when we moved to Michael's estate. But I know we were the very last in it. They were beautiful, the flats were lovely. You know, the whole area was done, the grounds was done. Like, the main thing with them, and there were several, but the real main thing was central heating.
As we got older in the 60s, and I got married in 67, and I moved over to Cadbrewer Barracks, was there for 8, 9 years. And the mother-in-law still lived in Keogh Square, then St Michael's Estate. Oh, when I moved in, it was fantastic. It was a lovely place. The central heated, and there was swings, there was multi-puzzles, everything. The place was spotless. Great.
I lived on the north side in a lovely house, but I didn't like the north side because I knew nobody over there, so I decided I'd look for a transfer. So they gave me Michael's Estate. Well, I lived in block 2 and I had a 3-bedroom, 2 big bedrooms, 1 small one, big sitting room, kitchen, bathroom, beautiful flat. Very easy to keep clean because everything was on the one level, no problem there, bathroom and all. But the people in it were brilliant, lovely people. Couldn't say a bad word about Michael's Estate.
First memory would have been back in the day going down there, and there was no sports hall there. I lived in the big tower that would have been on the far corner over on the right there. And I walked, it used to be a pathway. So I walked down there and I was only a small little kid, I was about 4. And come along there and I got to where the start of the building is there, and I got lost and I started crying, going, I'm lost. And my ma I could still remember my ma looking out, because we lived on 4th floor. My ma shouting, come back this way, come back this way. I wasn't hearing her, I was just going, I'm lost. Mary Keogh and Keogh, a woman called Keogh, Lorraine Keogh, and they were shouting to my ma, I have her here, I'll bring her back to you. You know, so that's my earliest memory.
And there were 2 4-storey blocks here, Block 6 and Block 7. Block 7 is where I lived in the 80s, you know, the 3rd floor. And I have good and bad memories, you know. I can remember the first time I moved in and I looked out the back window and found myself looking into a graveyard. It was very gothic. It was like a scene from Dracula, you know. And I was thought, gosh, when the kids see this, they'd be freaked. But funny enough, they never bothered them, you know. In fact, a lot of the kids around here, they used to get into the graveyard and play around.
We used to play in the graveyard, because at that stage, we're saying just in the early 80s thereabouts, they took the swings out of the flats, and then there's nothing else to play with, so the graveyard was the next best thing. There was dungeons in there, there was a monkey tree, there was walls, there was railings.
I lived here, about here it was. Yeah, I lived here for 5 years, but I lived in Block 9 for 11 years. And I moved in 1993, and when I first moved in, I was in the back blocks, and there were 2 small blocks at the back. We were quite happy enough around there because we all knew each other, neighbours was great. When I first moved in, you could walk out and leave your front door open.
You know, we all loved the flat. You wouldn't get a flat like it. The rooms, the size of the rooms. I mean, you had central heating through the floor, running hot water 24/7.
You used to dry the clothes. Your clothes was dried on the floors because the central heating come up through the floors. Now in the summer it was bad because wherever way the corpo done it, they had no control over it. There was no thermostats, no nothing. And so it must, when the oil crisis came in the 70s, it must have cost them a fortune, you know.
I think there was 346 families who lived on the estate. Overall, there was up to about 1,400 people who lived on this land. And so when they built this, they didn't think about a social life, you know, a physical and a social life. So they never built any centres or anything got to do with, you know, the social life of the people.
And in them days also, I have to say, there was larger families. There's not like just 2 kids now or 3 kids the way you'd have now. A lot of the families would have consisted of 10 in one, 6 in another, there was 7 in theirs, and all big families. Myself and Sharon Wynne and Michelle Keogh would have played a lot of football. As girls, going back in the day, it wasn't the in thing to do, you were classed as tomboys. And we played the football against the fellets, and we used to go down at 6 o'clock every night.
In the mornings, after the kids went to school, there was an eerie silence. You could hear the women in the floors underneath walking around, you know, the creaking of the doors. And of course the women, they had a habit of standing at the front windows in the kitchen, and they'd have a conversation between floors. And of course you could join in if you wanted, you know.
There were 6 of us on the land, and I was on a small land and there was 2 of us on big land and there was 4. And every one night a week, one of us got out and washed around the whole land and down the stairs. So that was done. The only day it wasn't done was Sunday. That was old neighbours. Then new people, when they came in, they weren't doing it.
Actually, the part I lived in St. Michael was the place where I lived in Keogh Square, right beside Joseph Millity's shop, and then from there to Clondalkin.
In general, it was a great place to grow up in. As in most communities, there's a small portion of bad apples, and even back then there was a small portion of bad apples, and that was detrimental to the community. But everyone else, like in general, were decent families.
Was the reason I moved out because the old choir stuff started coming in. So I was trying to move out because I had 4 girls and the boy was only small, and I said, I'm not taking a chance. So I moved out.
The government started giving grants, first-time grants to first-time house buyers. So people who were working and wanted to own their own places, they moved out.
So what happened was the surrender grant came in, which was £5,000 in 1984 or 85, one or the other. It was just there about 3. And those that did avail of it were mainly a lot of people who realised the opportunity when they had it. It took the heart out of the community. And once they moved to the likes of Ballyferm and Clondalkin and, you know, Lucan even, and so they went. So that what I always say is they left a shell of the community. So the community had to be rebuilt again.
So within about a year and a half, 70, 80 families who were kind of well known in the area and had been very involved in the tenants and very involved in keeping things going. An awful lot of them went to Ballyfermot and to Trimmer.
Deliver 47,000 social housing units by 2021 at a cost of over €5 billion.
I just didn't want to move. I loved my flat. And I know a lot of people couldn't understand that, but I didn't like what was outside my door.
There's a target of 35,000 social housing units at a cost of €3.8 billion.
This has been done not for the banks, it's been done for the economy, but the banks have been net gainers on this.
And then the drugs came on stream we say it was probably the early 80s. Children dying, or men and young men and young women dying at the time, and the mummies were frantic with worry as to how they're going to protect their children. When the drugs first came on stream, it was so bad that there's families I know, and there's 3 and 4 members of certain families just gone. They're my age, they should be still here.
At that stage, like, the parents were very concerned about the effects of it having on the young teenagers at that time. So they started up kind of like concerned parents, and loads of communities around Dublin did it as well.
At that time,
The drugs were just really taking hold, and for 5 years, I'd say, after that, it became worse and worse.
Like, they used to be able to sell drugs. There used to be one fella in particular who used to sell pills at the school gate. Then it got to the stage where they were doing then with the burning the barrels, and you wouldn't allow a taxi or a car come into the estate late at night because you knew that they were probably coming to do a dropsy or get a dropsy, one or the other.
We used to go out at night walking to keep drug pushers out. We'd be out all night. I walked at the time, and I'd often get in at 6 o'clock and I'd wash my face, and we went out, we walked the streets, we'd stop taxis coming in, if there was any strange looking people in it. There could have been 50 of us at a time. Now this was going on all night.
And then the marches on Throne Place, and there was a block there that used to be marched on, and up here that used to be Block H. There wasn't, it was called the H block, but it's not actually the H block. That was the block, you know. And then there was a lot of, what was it called, glue sniffing.
And I think what was happening all over the city. Was everyone was becoming aware of the impact of drugs, not just in Michael's estate. They were seeing it all over their own area, and they were thinking, what can we do about it?
But they got rid of those initial pushers or dealers or, you know, all that kind of stuff. They got rid of them. But then, and then the estate was clean for years.
And then it went underground. Now when it went underground, you didn't know where it was going. Like, it could be in that block, it could be in any block. Right? It could be in Throne Place, it could be in the houses down that road for all we know.
And at that time as well, you could go on the waiting list for the first time, on the housing waiting list, if you were a single parent, which hadn't happened before.
There were a lot of single parents who were only now allowed to have the right to live on their own at this stage because the social policy had changed. Lone parents were given flats now. So there was a lot of young social parents in behind doors that need to be reached.
So the lone parent thing was starting to come on stream more and more. So there was a lot of young women with young children who moved into the community, and it took time for them to integrate.
What happened was a group of women from the Towers, they were looking to get a flat on the estate, and then Sister Jo Kennedy came to live on the estate, and at that time she was able to, with the corporation, to get this number 70. So from there started up the Family Resource Centre. Jo had kind of set up a programme. The child was minded in one room, the women's programme was in another, the tenants group was in another, and the youth project was in that flat as well. So that happened. So then when I came, we got a little bit of funding, and then by 1993 we had campaigned to get it into the community development programme.
At the beginning, you see, when I went there was a locally based maintenance service. So you went over in the morning, you put it in the book, and you could be almost certain that whatever that maintenance was would be done. That all faded away more and more and more.
And then gradually they took the depot off the land, and then the stair lighting got broken, and they weren't doing the painting, and so it became to be dilapidated kind of areas. So the tenants took up around getting the flats painted. We stood over, that would have been the school, and we did come in with our vote. We were outside that, picketing for maintenance issues back then and for the refurbishment of the estate.
In one block over that used to be over there used to be sewerage coming up through the sinks. There was no stairwells being cleaned, there was no lifts working. It was just got so bad, and then there was vacant flats, a lot of vacant flats then.
The state itself adopted policies in the 80s which took people with decent wages out of the public housing system, and they effectively did what's called residualised the public housing sector and made it into a sector just for people on low incomes, which is quite in contrast to other European housing models. It didn't value its own stock, it didn't place any value in it, and it didn't actively put any value in it by maintaining it.
In 1994, what was happening in the city was that people were getting strength and they were pushing out there people who were taking drugs. So they pushed them out to places like St. Michael's Estate.
Then it kind of started seeping in, like I think it was the early 90s when the drugs started coming in, and it was fairly bad.
You'd look out your window and they were selling them out the windows and everything. Do you know what I mean? There was kids selling them out the windows. The kids that lived in the flats, they were selling out. They could be up all night selling drugs out the window. No matter when you look. And there was more cars came up Michael's Estate than there was in O'Connell Street, coming up looking for drugs, because they got them there. They were coming from everywhere, Dunleary and all. You know what I mean? Everyone was coming because they knew they could get them there.
They come up from Fatima, Rialto, they'd come from everywhere. That's very intimidating, and people didn't want to bring their children up in that atmosphere.
Then it was like a stopgap. People were coming in, staying there maybe 2 years and leaving again. So then you'd get a new crowd. It got then, with the drugs coming into it and that, people didn't want to live in it.
Like after a couple of years, you could see kind of other people coming down and hanging around the stairwells and stuff like that. And every year that'd go by, there'd be somebody moving out and somebody going somewhere else, and they took the community out. They took the heart of the people out.
Oh, it was horrible, horrible. At least when you'd be going to shop, you'd be going to school and you'd be coming back, you'd see somebody. Then when they started moving out, you could go all day and you wouldn't see anyone. Like come in and out, there was always somebody going in and out, and then all of a sudden there was nobody. Do you know what I mean? You were on the land and maybe there was 3 people living on the land. And I was 6. Yeah, it wasn't the same. People were starting to lock even their landing doors. Do you know, if you lived on the small land and 2 people there had locked their door. Because at that stage, people were getting afraid when they were coming up, so they'd lock the landing doors. It got then that we didn't want to live in the den. You know, that kind, well, it's not that we didn't want to live in it. We wanted it back the way it was, and we'd have never got it back. We'd have never got the people that we had in it.
You know, because it got so bad with the drugs at that stage, right? It was kind of like they abandoned us. The world and its mother abandoned us and left us with a shell of a community, and I mean a shell of a community that was dying on its knees. And then they commissioned a survey.
The survey was carried out, and it showed that 64% of the people wanted the estate pulled down. 33 who were the lifers, they'd always called themselves the lifers, they wanted them to be kept.
So when they were surveyed, they said they wanted to take it down and to rebuild from scratch.
We wanted houses here, we wanted front and back gardens, but that's what people wanted. So we were just going with what people wanted.
So from 2004 until 2008, May 2008, we worked to develop and design the PPP process through all its various stages, right up to the tender going out and McNamara and Castlethorne getting the job. And then we discovered that he was 1.5 billion in debt at that stage, and he was just reflective of the fact that like something was rotten in the state of Ireland.
St Michael's in Inchicore was one of 5 projects stalled when developer Bernard McNamara pulled out.
What we initially expected, I think most of us expected this, was that they were going to blow up the block the way they did in Ballymun. But they didn't do that. Actually, the last block here, you have footage of that as well, Joe. That last block there, the last number 70 was. They never notified us of the demolition, say, starting tomorrow morning. And I'll never forget, there was one in the house over there, and she just shouted up the crescent, "They're knocking the blocks down." I wouldn't come out that door in pyjamas to save their life, but everyone ran out in pyjamas that morning, because all you seen was a big claw coming in and just slowly but surely knocking the balconies away and the whole lot, you know, all that kind of stuff. And that's very hard to watch, because what you're seeing then, and then once it opened up, it was like an egg, right? So you had a shell of the egg and then it opened up, and then you're looking at people's wallpaper going, what the do you think of that wallpaper? And you know, whatever colour was on the walls, you know, it's still being exposed. But it was very hard to watch it and see it going, like, you know, because that's your whole life. When I look at it now and I think, God, it's hard to believe that it's gone. There's no, except for us who lived through it, there's nothing here to say that 10 blocks stood on this lump of land